Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm the host of this evening's program. I'm a county supervisor over here in Johnson County, and in Johnson County we have 5 supervisors. In some counties you have just 3 supervisors. That's the choice, 3 or 5. How many supervisors do you have in your county? You should find that out for next time. Iowa News and Views is a statewide community affairs program focused on current events that are of interest to Iowa. This show is being organized by volunteers to present topics of interest to Iowa and to, frankly, to focus more attention on some of the issues that face our state and communities. This is a weekly program. We produce a new show every 2 weeks. I recently came across a piece done by Mike Glover that that describes actually our first 3 shows of the season. We are in our 3rd week, and we've produced 3 shows, one dealing with taxes and corporate welfare, one dealing with the issue of parental notification, and finally, tonight's show discussing the death penalty. It's a mere coincidence that I think that the GOP is also interested in these topics, but we're glad you're joining us tonight. I'd like to present the disclaimer at this point. This public access station is not responsible for the content of the program. I'm responsible for what I say, and the guests are responsible for what they say. And like you, I may agree and disagree with some of the things that are said on the show, but it's leaving it up to you to decide what you think about what's being presented here this evening. Tonight's show, we are going to focus on the current debate in the state of Iowa over the death penalty. And with us, we have 2 guests. University of Iowa Professor of Law Dave Baldus is with us, a national expert on the question of the death penalty, and Richard Myers, Assistant House Minority Leader, a former Johnson County Supervisor, and a Democrat from Coralville. Dave, I'd like to open it up with you. Could you give us a brief history of the death penalty in Iowa as it relates to the question we're dealing with tonight?
When we started as a territory in 1838, we had the death penalty here on our books, and that continued up until 1872, and we had a 6-year period of abolition. And then it was reinstated in 1878 and stayed on the books until 1965. And during that period of time, I believe there were about 45 or 50 people that were executed in this state. And from the period 1930 to 1965, when abolition occurred, under Governor Hughes, there were 18 people that were actually executed here in the state.
I see. And Richard, could you give us a brief update on where we are with the death penalty debate here in Iowa, in the Iowa Senate in particular?
Well, there have been bills introduced both in the Iowa Senate and the Iowa House of Representatives at the present time. They are identical bills, except for maybe a sentence or 2. And at the present time, the bill is not being debated in the House, but it has been debated in the Judiciary Committee of the State Senate. And indeed, it had last week passed out of the State Senate by a very close 8-7 vote. So it is eligible for floor debate in the Senate. Currently, I understand the plan by the Senate leadership is to debate that bill, even though they are fairly well aware that the votes are not there to pass it, which is an interesting exercise. Usually that's not done in the legislature. And at the same time, it is my understanding that unless the bill would pass the Senate, which they say is unlikely now, the bill will not be debated in the House this year, but it will be debated next year. And that means the Judiciary Committee in the House will probably hold action on it until next year.
I see. Dave, in terms of the current legislation, who does this apply to?
It applies to 3 classes of people who commit first-degree murder. One would be someone who's serving in the penitentiary now a term of first-degree murder, life without parole. Someone who murders in the course of a kidnapping or in the course of a sexual assault. It's a very narrow, focused bill.
I see. And in terms of the current law in Iowa, if somebody commits a homicide, Dick, what is this current status of that? Is somebody in prison for their entire life? Do they get out of prison in a situation like that?
First-degree murder conviction in the state of Iowa means life in prison without parole. Now, unlike many other states, it means just exactly that in the state of Iowa. You do not get out. And the best evidence of that is that a life sentence being commuted in this state is fairly rare. Indeed, Governor Branstad, in his 14, 15 years as governor of this state, has commuted 2 life sentences. And Governor Ray commuted 21 life sentences in 14 years as governor of this state. There are currently 428 persons serving life prison sentences in the state of Iowa, but it means just that, life in prison without parole.
So we have 428 people in our state that are in our state prisons that
That's
will
correct,
never
yes.
get out of prison because of
That's
that
right.
particular crime. It's been noted that, I believe it was last year, we had about 60 homicides in our state. Dave, in terms of if this legislation's enacted, how many people are likely to be sentenced to the death penalty? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, very few. The estimates of the Iowa State Legislative Fiscal Bureau are that because of the narrowness of this measure, only about 2 or 3 people a year would even be candidates for a possible death sentence. So that would mean over a 25-year, or rather over a 10-year period, you might have 25 people who would be at risk of a death sentence. And the experience of other states typical of ours out here in the prairie and the mountain regions where there's not strong support for the death penalty suggests that over the next 10 years we might see 2 or 3 death sentences actually imposed.
So in terms of, do we have any sense how long the average person that's in for life in prison with life without parole, what their tenure is? Is it 10 years, 20 years, 30 years?
They say it's about 40 years.
It's about 40
Yes,
years.
that's the best information that we have at the
I see.
present time.
And what would be about the average cost of incarceration right now, Dick? Do you have a sense?
It's a little over $30,000 a year. Now that depends on what you're in there for, specifically in what prison you're in, because various prisons have a little different costs. And there are, of course, prisoners who require different types of attention in prison, and so there may be, the cost may go up or down. But basically, it's a little over $30,000 a year for a lifer.
I see. And the Fiscal Bureau just did a fiscal note on the whole cost question of if this legislation's enacted. Dave, could you give us a little summary of the relative costs of moving from life without parole, where somebody's in at the cost of, say, $30,000 a year, versus the kind of costs involved in establishing a system of that would deal with the death penalty?
Yeah, the general expectation here in Iowa is that it would cost about $1 million a year more to execute someone, to hold someone in prison for life. And nationally, that estimate is about $2 million. And the reason for it is that capital cases require a lot more representation throughout the process. Number 2, there are a lot more appeals and proceedings. And number 3, and this is something that people overlook, is that most death sentences that are imposed are actually vacated in the courts. So all of these enormous expenses that go into these prosecutions are all lost costs at the end of the day, because only about 10% or fewer of the people who are actually sentenced to death in these processes are actually ever executed. So that's why you have this enormous waste of resources in these proceedings.
I see. So if the point you made earlier, we'd have about 25 persons maybe over a 10-year period once this was up and operating. We'd be talking roughly anywhere from a minimum of, say, 25 million additional, or $25 million in these costs to basically enact this. It sounds rather expensive.
Well, what they're talking, though, about is what the cost of actual executions would be, because we would never have anywhere near that number of executions. You see, the thing that would add up the cost, let's assume you had 1 execution out of those 25 people, and that would be my guess as to what would be the most aggressive form the system would take. That would mean that you would have all of those costs loaded on to those other 25 cases with only 1 execution. That's part of what really enhances the cost so much.
I see. What has happened in, Dave, what has happened in other states that have enacted the death penalty in, say, the last 10 or 15 years?
Well, it varies tremendously, but I think the most relevant information for us in this state are other states that are like us, which I characterize as the prairie and near mountain states, places like South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana and Idaho. And those jurisdictions have had much broader statutes than we have, death penalty statutes, for over 20 years, and they've managed to execute only about 3 or 4 people during that whole period of time. The short of it is that in states like this, where there's such a sharp division of opinion on whether or not you should have the death penalty at all, this feeds back into the system. It makes it very hard for death sentences to be imposed or actually carried out.
One of the things that I've heard about the death penalty relates to the question of deterrence, you know, that this is on the books. It sounds like this is so narrowly focused, the question of having the death sentence for somebody that kills somebody in prison. Dick, what's the what's really the underlying that whole issue?
Well, I don't think there's any statistical evidence at all that the death penalty is a deterrent. Iowa, without the death penalty, has one of the lowest murder rates, if not the lowest murder rate in the country at the present time. And it's interesting that the average murder rate in states with the death penalty statutes as far back as 1993, the murder rate was over 1.5 times higher in the 14 states that did not have the death penalty at that time. So I'm not going to buy the argument that the death penalty is a deterrent. I think it's more an issue of whether or not the state has the right to commit an act of revenge than it is particularly a deterrent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's also been noted in the literature, and I know there's been quite a bit of study on this, the racial disparity that exists when the death penalty is given to somebody. And disproportionately, it appears there's strong evidence it's disproportionately used on African Americans, for example. Dave, what has been the history of this around the country as it relates to that question?
Well, the history has been that the principal form of discrimination relates to the race of the victim more so than the race of the defendant. That is, offenders who kill white people are at much higher risk of receiving a death sentence than those who kill blacks and other minorities. And the reason for that is that killing white people causes more of a sensation in the community. Most of the people that are running the criminal justice system, including the juries and the prosecutors, are generally white, so therefore they respond more punitively to cases involving white victims. But there also is evidence that black offenders in some jurisdictions are at greater risk of receiving a death sentence. And I have concern, particularly here in Iowa, if the system is used very infrequently, that there's a good chance that it will be used in a racially discriminatory fashion here.
I see.
I think one of the other factors that comes into play too is economics. There are very few wealthy folks that are going to find their way into death row. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that comes into play in any death penalty case is the ability to have competent counsel, and I mean very competent counsel. Mm-hmm. And of course, if you don't have the resources to hire that counsel, you can't generate the public sympathy to hire that counsel, you know, the backing, whatever it takes, you're not going to get as good a defense. And that is evidenced by who you see on death row in this country. It isn't wealthy people. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with the amount of money they can afford to defend themselves.
One of the things that concerns me about the death penalty in general is the idea that sometimes innocent people might be killed through this approach. And last year there were 4 people released from prison. Since 1973, there's been about approximately 66 people released from prison. Dave, how should we be concerned about this? It seems like a huge number.
It is a matter of serious concern. It's been a matter of concern since the very first day, and the people in this state began to debate this issue. And that figure indicates that 1 out of every 100 people that have been sentenced to death in this country over the last 20 years have been found to be factually innocent. And we don't have any idea how many people there are on death row that have not been found to be factually innocent. The only good thing I can say about it is we don't have any strong evidence that anybody in the last 20 years who was innocent was actually executed. But with that number of false convictions, obviously you're running a significant risk that might occur.
I see. You're watching Iowa News and Views. We are discussing the death penalty this evening with Dave Baldus and Richard Myers. We'll be back in just a moment after a brief word about our Internet discussion forum.
Hi, my name's Rusty Martin. I'm one of the volunteers involved in Iowa News and Views, and I'm here to talk to you about the Internet side of Iowa News and Views. Have you ever heard of an email discussion or a listserv discussion on the Internet? That's where a group of people interested in the same topic subscribe to a list, sort of an automated newsletter. Then if someone has a comment, they send an email to the list, and then a copy is bounced to everyone else. We have something like that going for Iowa News and Views. We've got the show's sponsors, the volunteers on the show, as well as anyone else interested in the topics raised on Iowa News and Views. You can comment on past shows, give suggestions about future shows, comment about ways that we can improve the show, or just talk about anything related, anything that you think would be of interest to people who watch Iowa News and Views. To subscribe, all you have to do is send a message to inews@pobox.com. We'll send you all the details. Let's take a look and see how this might work in action. Let's say that you were a viewer in Sioux City, and you had a concern about the water quality of the Missouri River. You'd go and start up your computer, start up your email program. When it comes time to make a new message, when it comes time to type in the address, you type in the address of the Iowa News and Views listserv. When you send your message, it would go there and bounce out to everyone. I'll type up my message. I think you should do a show about the water quality of the Missouri River, and here are 2 local people in Sioux City who would be excellent guests for that show. Bing, there it goes over the internet.
Well, I think I'll check my email today. Oh, a message from Sioux City regarding water quality on the Missouri River. That's a great idea for a show. I think I'll send back a reply. Yes, other viewers have indicated some interest in water quality issues, and we intend to have a show in the near future on this. Very good. I'll send that back off.
It wasn't that easy. You can be in this discussion. It's almost like everyone was in the same room talking with you. All you have to do to subscribe, send a message to inews@pobox.com. And if you ever decide you want to unsubscribe, all the instructions will be there. You'll be able to do that yourself. I hope to see you online.
Hi, we're back again with Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. Remember, no flipping. We are talking about the death penalty tonight. We have Dave Baldus, professor of law, University of Iowa, a nationally known expert on the death penalty, and Richard Myers, a House Assistant Minority Leader, Democrat from Coralville. And we've been visiting about the death penalty. I guess we'll pick it up again with a question to you, Dick. The Des Moines Register did a poll in January of this year discussing Iowans' feelings about the death penalty, and 74% of Iowans suggested they were in favor of this. What does that poll tell us, and how should we be looking at that?
Well, one thing that poll did not mention, it didn't ask the complete question about the death penalty. It didn't explain what the situation is with the penalties for first-degree murder in this state. 74% of the folks, when you didn't consider life without parole, were for the death penalty. But when you injected that phrase into the equation, then that number dropped to around 50%. And frankly, it has been that 50%, around that 50% figure for some time. In fact, if you go back to the last time we debated the death penalty in 1995, in January of that year, the number was 78% for the death penalty, but when you put life without parole into the equation, that number began to drop down toward a 52, 53 percentile range. And indeed, when we did vote on that bill in March of 1995, February of 1995, excuse me, why the figure was at 52%. So it did pass the House on a very narrow vote. The support for it in the legislature also weakened at that time, which was interesting, I thought, because when we came into the House of Representatives in '95, the vote was around 65 to 66 votes for the death penalty in the House of Representatives. The final vote was 54-44, which weakened it so much that the Senate subsequently defeaed the death penalty in 1995 on a 39-11 vote on a very bipartisan fashion. So I think what it demonstrates to me is when there's knowledge about the subject and the public is educated about it, the support for the death penalty is rather ambivalent at best.
I see. Well, maybe a follow-up question to you, Dick, on that question. Given the high support, or what would appear to be high support, what are the constituency groups out there encouraging the legislature? Is there a groundswell out there, do you think, for this reenactment of the death penalty?
I have never been able to detect any political groundswell for the death penalty. The impetus for it, frankly, has come from the governor's legislative agenda and some rather ambitious House members who I think are aiming for higher office, and they would like to use this vote as some sort of barometer to measure their commitment to be tough on crime. Beyond that, I have not ever discerned any notable constituent group that has been for the death penalty. In 1995, I was listed in the Catholic Messenger as an undecided vote. Now, that was not an accurate statement, but it just meant that I had not returned their questionnaire. Anyway, the upshot of that was it generated all sorts of mail, the fact that I was undecided. And I mean, I received sometimes 50, 60, 70 letters a day, postcards, all kinds of different sorts of communication. I did not get a single letter for the death penalty until the day before the actual vote. I got one letter. I don't know how many hundreds of letters I got against the death penalty. So if there's a constituents group out there, they are very silent in their support. However, there's no question about the fact that it is an issue that can be exploited in an election, and we've seen that demonstrated. And indeed, this morning, in the paper, in the Des Moines Register, and in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, I noticed that the governor of the state said that the death penalty will be used against Democrats who want to vote against it in the next 1998 election. So to me, that is the constituency right there. A political agenda, nothing more and nothing less.
Well, it seems to me, in watching this the last few years, is that it is a good political issue that seems to just be trotted out at election time to beat people up, but there doesn't seem to be the interest to actually, or the support, frankly, to enact it. Dick, you raised the question of the religious community's involvement in this debate. Dave, can you reflect on how the religious community has come together around this issue?
Yes, it's been remarkable that, that the religious coalition that operates in Des Moines is one of the most articulate opponents of the death penalty. And this opposition on the part of religious bodies has been growing in recent years, and most notably on the part of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has, over the last 20 years, paid more and more attention to this issue. And 2 years ago, Pope John issued an encyclical which came out almost to the point of condemning the death penalty. It said it was unnecessary. There are no circumstances in our society where we need to use this kind of punishment.
So with all the attention going into this death penalty debate, it seems there are some other criminal justice issues out there that I think we as a state need to be focused on. I know here in Johnson County we see a significant increase in juvenile problems, juvenile crime, the severity of those crimes seems to be getting more serious. What are we doing in this state, Dick, to address prevention and early intervention in kids' lives?
Well, the short answer is we're not doing enough. This is one of the things that bothers me about the death penalty, because I don't want to treat this as a trivial issue at all, because it isn't. It's a very serious issue, and people feel very strongly about it when they get a chance to really sit down and think about it. But what really is happening here by discussing the death penalty when there's a relatively ambivalent support for it, except in the political scene, we are hiding or staying away from what is the real problem in this state as far as crime is concerned. Let's look back just 3 years. Every year for 3 years, we've built a new prison in this state. That ought to shock people, I think, that the state of Iowa would see the need to build a new prison. We have more people under incarceration right now, some 6,500, I believe, as of today, than we've ever had before. And that number has gone up dramatically in the last 5 years. Indeed, when you look at the causes of some of this, you have to start with the issue of juvenile justice and juvenile crime. We have 300 and some school districts in this state, and yet we only have 62 alternative high schools. In the city of Des Moines and Polk County, on any one given day, we will see 1,400 to 1,500 children on the streets of Des Moines that should be in some structured program, school, whatever you want to call it. They should be there. They should not be on the streets. The police say they're committing 150 crimes a day that they know about. Now, those are the kinds of things that we need to be dealing with as far as crime is concerned in this state. And it's a place where we ought to be putting our resources. And it should take a two-pronged effort. First of all, we need to deal with those folks who are violent in school and who have committed abuse and crimes against people. We need to be able to deal with that in a swift and certain way. And secondly, the most important thing is early intervention. We are not doing enough to deal with early childhood reading problems, with family support problems, things like being sure somebody gets a good meal at the beginning of the day, Head Start, things of that nature. We've decided to cut those kinds of funds. We're not interested in whether mom and dad have got a decent job or not. Promise Jobs, for example, needs proper funding for that. Daycare for mothers so that they know that children have some supervision. Those are the kinds of things that are much more important than dealing with the death penalty. And if we want to deal with the fact that we're building a prison a year, maybe we ought to start looking at some of our early intervention problems.
Very good. In terms of the system in Iowa, Dave, how would you characterize our juvenile or our criminal justice system?
I think we have a very exemplary criminal justice system here in the state, and I think some of the strongest evidence of it is the very low crime rates, including homicide and murder rates in the state. And I think part of that is the fact that we deliver sure, swift, and very severe punishment for people who commit homicide, true life without the probability of parole. And what appeals to me about it as an alternative to the death penalty is that there's no room for the exercise of discretion in it on the part of prosecutors. Everybody's treated the same under the state law. People go to prison for life. It reduces the risk of arbitrariness. There's plenty of time if there have been miscarriages of justice, and we have had some in this state, and they've been discovered later on, and people have been released from prison. And the costs of it are much less, and they're predictable. So I think we have a system that gives people in the state a lot of confidence in our basic criminal justice system.
Very good. It's been a pleasure to visit with you both tonight about this important topic, and we would encourage our viewers to make contact with their legislators in Des Moines. I'd like to thank our guests, Richard Myers, Assistant House Minority Leader, Democrat from Coralville, and Dave Baldus, Professor of Law at the University of Iowa. It's been a very informative show. Our next show, we'll be talking taxes again. There's a lot of debate in Des Moines about that, and we think we want to return to that topic and spend a little bit of time about that. We want to know what you think of the show, and in a second we're going to give you our internet address, our phone number, and our mail address to send us your ideas for future topics, future guests, and how you like what we're doing and how we might improve it. We'll also let you know how to find our webpage where you can learn more about the show. Also, please consider joining us on the internet discussion forum that you learned about earlier in the program. We're also going to give you the email address for that in a second. We encourage you to join us on the internet to discuss show topics and any other issues you think are important to your community or the state of Iowa. I'd like to thank our local sponsors who are making it possible for us to have this show on. I'd like to thank our contributors who have financially helped us, and of course our volunteer crew here this evening producing this show. I'd also like to thank you for tuning in and checking it out. Don't forget to set your VCR for next time. We'll be back, same time, same place. And I have a good friend that tells me that if you see it on TV, it must be real. And that's certainly true, but I want you to also remember that this is just a TV program, and what's important is what you're doing in your community every day to make it a better place and to make our state a better place. So thanks for being with us. My name is Joe Balcom. I'm the host of Iowa News and Views, and we appreciate your watching. Good night.